So in the mid-1980s, as some of you know, maybe most of you, ELI transformed from a traditional ESL program into an English for Academic Purposes department, which was focused on serving the needs of students and scholars at the University of Michigan. And ELI faculty were early in recognizing that graduate students had writing and speaking needs distinct from those of undergraduates, and that there was a dearth of teaching materials to help teachers meet these needs. This has led to the creation of extensive original teaching materials and the development of several texts specifically focused on graduate communication, including the landmark Academic Writing for Graduate Students, which will itself be a focus of today's final panel. And now we're fortunate to have the AWG's co-authors join scholars literally from around the world to explore important issues facing those working with graduate student speakers and writers. Our moderator, Christine Feak, is a lecturer in the English Language Institute, and she's our resident expert on graduate student writing. I would say not only our resident expert on graduate student writing. Chris also coordinates ELI 994, a collaboration with the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, which provides language and pedagogy training for international teaching assistants in LSA. You can hear about that over lunch at a poster. In addition to AWG, Chris has co-authored with fellow panelist John Swales and co-author John Swales, English in Today's Research World, a new book series focused on the writing of research genres and subgenres. She also serves as co-editor of the journal English for Specific Purposes and is a co-founder of the recently constituted Consortium on Graduate Communication, an interdisciplinary professional organization bringing together teachers and scholars from the fields of EAP, composition, rhetoric, and writing across the disciplines. Another of our panelists, Jane Freeman, is on the board of the CGC and has asked me to mention that there is a Summer Institute coming up next June. This will be the second annual iteration of this event. The first one happened at Yale this past June. It was a wonderful experience, so I encourage you, if you're interested, to check out. There's some flyers on the check-in table. Okay, but I will now get out of the way and say, please help me welcoming Christine Feak.
Thank you, Angelo. I'm going to keep my comments really, really short because I know everybody's here to hear more from our guest speakers. But just as the first session was focused on where we are and where we're going, our panel is also going to talk about where we are in terms of writing and what are some of the things that are coming up in terms of graduate writing support. And when I talk about graduate writing support here, I really want to emphasize that we're not dividing graduate writers between native speakers and non-native speakers because all graduate students need some form of writing support. And as was suggested in Dr. Davies' presentation, there's a lot going on in academic English that we're largely unfamiliar with. It's nobody's first language. Everybody needs some kind of language support. But then how do we move ourselves beyond the word level, the phrase level, the registered level, and think about how we then use words to communicate our ideas and our research to a much broader audience? So moving forward, I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker here, Brian Paltridge. And Brian Paltridge is a professor of TESOL at the University of Sydney in Australia. He is a leader in the field on genre analysis, graduate writers, graduate student advisor mentoring. He is well known among us in the field of teaching English for academic purposes, specifically teaching graduate writers. His work has appeared in a number of peer-reviewed journals. I can't mention them all, but Applied Linguistics, English for Specific Purposes, Journal of Second Language Writing, also the IEEE Transactions on Professional Communication, you name it, Brian's work is there. He is a former editor of English for Specific Purposes, and I'm just honored to be following in his footsteps as well as in John's in that regard. But he is currently the co-editor of TESOL Quarterly, one of the major publications in our field. He also is an author of a number of books and co-author of books as well. He is responsible for the Handbook of English for Specific Purposes with Sue Starfield. He also is co-author with Sue Starfield and Chris Tardy of the book Ethnographic Perspectives on Academic Writing. And he's a widely sought-out guest speaker around the world, and it is my absolute pleasure to have Brian here with us today. Thank you.
So how do I get my one going? Sorry.
Wait, I forgot. That's okay.
It's there, I think.
Brian.
No, the one there, yeah.
Is that you?
Yeah, I can get up to full picture. And how do I change the slide? How do I change? I think I can.
Do you have a clicker, or you can
I'll use that one.
Yeah.
Good, okay. Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for your very kind words, and especially thank you, Angela and Chris, for inviting me here today to this event. I'm very honoured to be at this event, but also to be speaking on this panel with these people here, so thank you so much for that. The title of my talk today, as you can see, is Looking Inside the World of Peer Review, Implications for Graduate Student Writers. And I'd like to talk about some work that I've been doing with my colleague Sue Starfield, which has this as its particular focus, and in particular, the issues and challenges that graduate student writers face as they're writing and submitting their work to academic journals for publication. So to start off, as Mary Jane Carey has said in supporting graduate student writers, there's a growing pressure worldwide for students to publish early and often. And as she says, in the North American context, and indeed really in very many places, certainly where I'm working, pressures are growing as the diminishing number of tenure-track faculty positions exacerbates competition for jobs. And this, I think, has implications for the field of graduate communication, and in particular, the increased need to support graduate student writers in the process of getting published in academic journals. And of course, we've got books such as Mary Jane and Teresa Lillis's book on getting published in academic journals, and the Swales and Feak volumes which surround this endeavour. So what I'm saying today won't in any way be new to them, and of course to the people that are here today. But I think more broadly, we need to encourage teachers of graduate student writing to talk as much as they can with students, not just about what good research writing looks like, but also what's involved in getting it published, so we can demystify the process for them as much as we can by giving them insights into what, for many of them, is a really very mysterious process, so that we can help them achieve their academic publication goals. So today I'd like to talk about a book on getting published in academic journals, which I wrote with Sue Starfield, which has just come out with the University of Michigan Press, which aims to do this in some way. And I'd like to sort of give you a sense of how we frame this book and some of the points we make in our book that we think are important for graduate student writers wanting to get published in academic journals. So here's the cover of our book. So the book that we wrote, is, while it covers much of the same ground that you would expect to see in a book in this topic, what we've tried to do is base it on our own experiences of getting published in academic journals, of teaching courses on writing for publication, reviewing articles for peer-reviewed journals, as well as having been editors of academic journals. So while it covers the areas you would expect to see in a book on this topic, it's kind of in some ways a personal account. Certainly, we've brought into it some of our own experiences with this process, which in sharing them with our readers, we hope will help to give them more of an insider's view of what's involved in navigating the publication process, which you can see as the subtitle of our book. What we'd like to say amongst all of this is that while what we have said in our book may be obvious to experienced authors and, of course, journal editors, we need to keep in mind that it's not at all so obvious to beginning academic writers, and that there are many things they need to know and be able to do in order to get their work successfully published that may not at first be so obvious to them. So what we've tried to do in our book is unpack the process of getting published in academic journals for beginning academic writers, a process which, even for those who are successful at academic publish, find at times challenging to deal with. So what I'd like to do today is go over very briefly some of the main themes we discuss in our book, and to give you some of the extracts or quotes from our experiences that we've put in the book to give you a sense of how we've approached this particular topic. So what you have on the screen is the main themes, you could say, that we've covered in our book. What's involved in writing for academic journals, deciding which journal to send your article to, connecting with readers of research articles, understanding the process of peer review, and reading reviewers' reports and addressing their concerns. So in our discussion of what's involved in writing for academic journals, we talk about what editors, reviewers, and readers will expect to see in a research article. So this is a quote we have from our book. It's something we have learned, and I'm sure many other people in this room that are journal editors as well will have had this experience, is someone writes an article, a beginning academic writer, they've given us the results and they go straight to the end. And of course we want to know, what does this add to the field? How does this move things forward? So we've got this little point here. We say a very common mistake with submissions to peer-reviewed journals is a misunderstanding of what to include in a discussion section. So many new writers think they should discuss their findings, which in fact is only partly true. In this section, writers are expected to discuss their findings in relation to the previous research on the topic so that readers can see how the study that's being reported on contributes to extending knowledge in the field. That is how the study moves the field forward. And if they don't do that, they might get a letter from the editor. And it's one of the things, we have a bank of author responses, and one of the ones when we come across this with TESOL Quarterly, we would say something like, in your discussion section, could you compare the results of your study more to previous research on your topic, such as the material you cite at the beginning of your paper, so readers can see in more detail how your study moves the field forward. And this really reminds me of when I finished I was doing my PhD and I'd finished my results chapter and I thought it was kind of all over. And my supervisor said, oh no, this is where it begins. And I think there's some real truth in that, because what does it actually mean? What is it telling us? What is it telling us that we didn't know that we really want to know? And so this is the next big bit. And when we get a submission from a new author, it's one of the things we look to see. What is this telling us? You might put it in a discussion section. You may combine results and discussion, but you've got to do it in some way. So that's one of the things we talk about the sort of things that we would expect to see in a journal. When we talk about which journal to send an article to, we talked about things like considering the type of journal, whether it's disciplinary, interdisciplinary, newer or regional, and other things such as impact factors, acceptance rates, who publishes in the journal, and who's on the board of the journal. We tell this little story here about TESOL Quarterly, actually, which these are kind of figures you don't see very often. In fact, getting hold of acceptance rates is sometimes quite complicated. So I did this kind of little analysis here because we know the acceptance rates for some of the big journals is really very low. In 2014, TESOL Quarterly was 6.7. That's low. In 2015, it was 4%. So in 2014, 93% of full-length articles that were submitted to the journal didn't get published. But the point we want to make is these numbers don't actually tell the full story. The good news is that certainly with TESOL Quarterly, 64% of the submissions that were sent out for review in 2014 were asked to make revisions to their article. And further, 75% of those authors who were asked to make revisions finally got published. So that I think does tell you quite a different story. So what this says, if you're asked to revise your article, there's a good chance it will get accepted for publication. So our point would be, if you're asked to revise your article, revise it. Well, I'll come to a point in a moment where I'll tell the story of a friend of mine who didn't understand that. Threw it in the bottom drawer. I'll come back to her in a moment because not everyone understands it. I say to my students, anything other than the rejection is good news. They go, what? Anything other than the rejections. It means they do want it. I mean, what you have to do to it's another matter, but it's all good news if it wasn't rejected. In our discussion of, this is a kind of a personal story, yeah, that's the one I know, and connecting with readers, we talk about the importance of a good title. This example illustrates that. We give suggestions for writing a successful abstract. We talk about reading as a writer, reading to think how have people written their text and things like that, the way they've organised their article, the use of language and things like that. But this is an example I give from a paper, something I did quite some years ago. And Chris said, I've done some work in the area of genre analysis. In my early days, I was keen that this is what I was going to be known for. I was going to be one of the genre people. So I got that word genre into everything that I was writing, including an article that had nothing to do with genre. And so I sent it off to this article, and they said, it's got nothing to do with genre. And I thought, well, and they were right. So there's a little bit more to that story than I'm telling you right now, but it actually had very little to do with genre. It was about discourse interpretation. I revised the article, taking on board the issues that were raised, but I completely reframed it, and I got it published. So, a good article can help you, and a bad one can sink you, and I certainly found that one out. In our discussion of understanding the peer review process. We talk about what it involves, the roles of editors and reviewers. We talk about what's expected of authors in this process, no dual submissions, as you all know, responding to requests for revision promptly. And we talk about our favourite authors. Now, our favourite authors are those that follow submission requirements and guidelines to the letter and don't expect the editors to fix it all up for them. I mean, anyone who's been a journal editor will recognise this, thinking, you know, if you can't get your bibliography right, you know, and this is exactly the example we give. You know, sometimes I've sent back a submission which I think in every other way has got the potential to move forward, but the bibliography is just missing things and stuff like that. And I think to myself, a reviewer will say, if the author's been this careless about the references, how careful have they been with the research? You don't want a reviewer to be thinking that. So that's why I'll sometimes send something back several times. They think I'm being picky, but I know the effect this has on a reader. So we talk about, you know, our favourite authors. And you want to be one of our favourite authors. In the section on, this is a comment I mentioned a moment ago, responding to reviewers' reports. I've got a friend who's published now in many of the top journals in her field, but she was publishing some stuff from her dissertation, and she got major revisions for her very first submission. She just put it in the bottom drawer and thought, oh, they don't like it. And her supervisor said to her a few months later, well, what happened to that article? She said, well, they didn't like it. He said, are you mad? You got major revisions. That's good news. The editor wants it. You just need to do more work on it. She got the article out of the drawer, she revised it, she sent it back to the journal, it was published in Applied Linguistics. So, you know, don't throw it in the bottom drawer. So when we talk about dealing with rejection, we also give this quote. We've got this quote in the book from Yoko Kubota, who said in the chapter she wrote a few years back, she said, never give up. If one journal rejects your paper, it doesn't necessarily mean that the manuscript's not worth publishing. If you think your manuscript presents legitimate arguments, send it to another journal. Revising it, of course, align as much as you can with your feedback you received on your paper. So an important point we make in our book is graduate students shouldn't be discouraged by what seems to be the very high standing of the journal they want to publish in or in what's involved in getting published. When I was doing my PhD, I read this comment, 1993, from Ros Mitchell. At that time, she was the editor of Applied Linguistics. And it seems like a very negative comment, but actually I was very encouraged by it. She said, it's important to bear in mind that a rejection from one journal doesn't mean your paper's unpublishable. Rejection's common, it's normal, it's frequent, and by no means means that the paper won't find a home somewhere else. So this actually encouraged me to send an article to her journal that drew on something from my dissertation, knowing that if I didn't succeed there, I could send it to the next journal on my list. However, as it was, after several rounds of revisions, the article was accepted and indeed published in her journal, which I think highlights this point that Rose and McKinley make in their new book on doing research in applied linguistics, that obstacles that seem to hinder us can in fact help us improve the quality of our research. So now, when I teach writing for publication, I take copies of reviews that I've received on my work to class to show to my students. And they find that extremely useful and interesting because they very rarely get to see these texts, especially from someone who they can see as being a fairly successful author. I've had some students say, I don't know how you picked yourself up from the floor after you got that reviewer's report. But I want to show you my favorite one. I sent this article off in 2006 to a journal, and this is the reply that I got. Your paper has now been evaluated. It did not survive on the editorial committee's shortlist of articles for publication in 2006. That was it. No reason why. I have since, however, published the work from that paper somewhere else, which goes back to Ros Mitchell's very helpful comment. So, what are the implications of what I've said today for graduate student writers? To go back to Mary Jane's chapter on graduate student writing, writing is the chief mechanism by which students are recognized as members of disciplinary communities, a means of developing and displaying an identity as a researcher, scholar, or other professional. So, where do we go from all here? So, this is a chapter which I found really useful by Gaofeng Li, who came from China, moved from China to Canada in the mid-1990s to earn her PhD, and she's now a professor at the University of British Columbia. And this is her advice to beginning academic writers. She says, write, write, write. So our advice for graduate writers who want to get published in academic journals would be plan your writing, put aside time for writing, and write. Thank you. And here's my references.
Thank you very much, Brian. We're going to hold off questions until the very end, just so that we can kind of keep on schedule here. But I would like to add just one point to what Brian said, and that is another message that we need to take away is that there's a lot of strategy behind getting published. And knowing that strategy is an essential part of supporting our graduate writers. And it makes me think then, okay, well, how do we get them to the point where they're actually thinking strategy? They've got the paper, they've got the article, they've got the research. How do we get them to that point? So let's turn things back a little bit and think about how we might support our graduate writers while they're on that journey towards getting their work published, and thinking about all the other kinds of writing that constitute the world of academic writing that a graduate student might do. Graduate students face a number of challenges, and luckily there are a number of ways of supporting these students. And Jane is going to talk a little bit about a program that she's developed at the University of Toronto, which I admire very much for its creativity and how it tries to serve students along the way. Jane is a senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto. She's the founding director of the School of Graduate Studies Office of English Language and Writing Support. She's established an innovative modular curricula of non-credit courses, workshops, and a writing center, and designed quite a lot of the workshop material to support her graduate student writers. She's explored the needs of graduate students at all stages of their career and has found ways to figure out what students need at what point. And as Jane most recently said at our Yale CGC meeting, unlike graduate education, doctoral education does not follow a strict timetable, suggesting the need for flexibility and creativity in our support. Jane has broad scholarly interests, Shakespeare, in case you didn't know that, classical rhetoric, oral and written communication of graduate students, and she's written a number of articles in these areas. She's also an integral member of the Stratford Festival community, if you all know the famous Stratford Festival. Jane has also recently completed a fantastic book in collaboration with Professor Ursula Franklin entitled Ursula Franklin Speaks, Thoughts and Afterthoughts, and this will form an integral part of what she is going to talk about today. Jane.
Could I have some help to get the... Forward once I get going?
You can do it here or with the clicker.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to help celebrate the 75th anniversary. I'd like to talk today about a phenomenon I'm seeing in graduate student note-taking, and I'm going to call that phenomenon de-skilling. Brian talked about the end of the writing process. I'm going to go way back to the beginning of the graduate writing process when they're first taking notes. And my hypothesis is that some of the new challenges I'm seeing in graduate student note-taking are in response to some of the new technologies that have occurred in the last 10 years. And I want to say from the outset, like any technologies, these tools are very powerful and very effective, but I'm going to suggest they are less dangerous for skilled researchers than they are for novice researchers, and that as teachers of writing, we might be doing more to help our students use masterfully technologies that they are using problematically, and they're technologies that many of us as teachers did not use ourselves, so they may be a little bit off our radar. At least they were off mine. I want to do 4 things today. I'll start by defining what I mean by de-skilling, and then talk about, just briefly survey some of the technologies I mean, just in case some of them aren't familiar, some of the problems they might cause for new graduate writers, and a few strategies that we might use as teachers of graduate writing to help our students. So to begin, and this is where Ursula comes in. Ursula Franklin is a physicist who is very well known for her work on the social impacts of technology. And she told a story in the book that we worked on together, Ursula Franklin Speaks, that has really helped me to see what I'm talking about today. And that story I'll just relate briefly. She was raised in Austria, and when she moved to Canada to work as a postdoc in physics, she was surprised by the severity of the injuries that her colleagues were coming back with after skiing weekends. They were coming back with broken bones, and she hadn't seen this in Austria, though she'd grown up skiing. And she came to believe that the problem was ski lifts. She said in Austria, when she skied as a child, you had to climb the hill on your skis. And so you fell and you learned how slippery the snow was, and you developed snow skills on the way up the skill. And if you weren't very good, you didn't get very high, and as you got better, you got higher. So you had more snow skills on your way back down the hill. And she called this learning by the way learning that occurs, and you don't really notice it because you're trying to learn something else. And I've come to believe that that story works as a fairly accurate analogy for some of the note-taking technologies that our students are using, that are helping them to get, as it were, sort of high up the mountain, and they're experiencing some crashes on the way down. I first started to see this phenomenon. I was teaching a course that I designed called Becoming a Better Editor of Your Own Work. I've been teaching that course for about 10 years. And I began to see that the editorial work grad students were doing was actually, a lot of it needed to happen at the level of content and structure, which brought me to think of Cicero's 5 Canons of Rhetoric. I'm a rhetorician, as Chris mentioned. And the editor course is really about elocution style. The last 2, as you'll know, are about oral presentations. But the first 3 really relate to both oral and written work. And the editor course, in my mind, had sort of been about style, language, concision, clarity, coherence. But the problems I was seeing was conceptual confusion, content that was not clear to the authors, structure that was cumbersome and causing all sorts of problems. So I decided to go back. A few years ago, I designed a prequel to that course, which I called Pre-Writing Strategies for Developing and Organizing Your Ideas. And of course, pre-writing strategies are not new to anyone in this room. And I thought I would be doing something sort of predictable, and in fact I am, but I became much more aware of problems that are occurring at the note-taking stage than I had really understood. So today I want to talk about strategies for notes during lectures that students are using and that they're taking in response to source texts. And I'm going to focus mostly on the second, since that type of note-taking has the most direct bearing on the way graduate students write. Now, when I was a graduate student, which was a fairly long time ago, but not too many decades ago, I took notes by hand during lectures. A little bit later, people started taking notes by using laptops. It's a bit of a tedious process. But as you take notes in that way, you're paraphrasing, you're trying to keep up, you're engaging with the ideas, you're not getting distracted, and you're trying to realize, I don't know what that word means, I don't understand that concept. So there's a chance to know what you don't know at the moment and to ask a question about it while the lecture is still going on. Many of our students, of course, are still taking notes that way, but in recent years, some students, particularly non-native speakers of English, often ask to use digital recorders, which means they compile hundreds of hours of lecture recordings that they need to listen to again. And of course, they ask for PowerPoint slides. And it's becoming increasingly common for students to use PowerPoint slides in lieu of notes. So if I've got the slides, oh, I can't come today, but could you send me the slides? Did I miss anything? Could you send me the slides? No, we sat in revered silence because you weren't there. Yes, you missed something. Now, of course, slides are not notes. And PowerPoint slides create several problems, in my opinion. One is that bullets are mistaken for content. And of course, anybody who gives speeches knows that the speech is not on the slide. That's just a bullet. And the students start to gather a lot of them. They go to many classes, and they go to many lectures, and every class has several weeks of slides, and then they end up with something that looks like this. So another problem that they run into is that they are collecting and not absorbing. They're mistaking having the slides for understanding what's on the slides. They also experience pretty severe overload. And in my pre-writing class, I'm finding students who are paralyzed because they're overwhelmed. And it's in part because of the way they're collecting their information. And also, there's no real way to synthesize this information or analyze it. They have to go back over it again. It's incomplete and fragmented. And so one small strategy, as I say, I want to really focus on the way they take notes on papers. But one small strategy is to provide handouts with gaps and explain why you're doing it. and explain that writing is cognitive and that taking notes and paraphrasing and keeping up and interrupting and asking will help them to absorb. And if they try to let the slides do the work of the absorption later, they may find at the end of the term, when they're looking at a mass of PowerPoint slides, that they don't understand things as well as they need to move forward. Now I want to talk about notes taken in response to source texts, because that's where the students are getting into the most trouble with writing. And I believe that pre-writing strategies, of course, are important for everybody, but I think they're most important for graduate students more than for undergrads, for a variety of reasons. Undergrads are given topics, graduate students are trying to discover topics. Undergrads are looking for things that's already known, graduate students are trying to find something original. Undergrads deal with much lower volume of material. They're not looking at as many articles or chapters. Graduate students are overwhelmed often with volume. The papers in undergraduate are typically shorter, as opposed to graduate school. Usually students have never written a paper of 50 pages or 100 or 200 pages. And the deadlines are further away. So if you're a really bad pre-writer as an undergrad, that's all right, you cram, you'd have 2 weeks, the thing's due in 2 weeks, how lost can you get? Well, you can get 2 weeks worth lost, but in grad school you can get very seriously lost, especially in the humanities. If you're not meeting your supervisor very often, you're not meeting that person until you've got a draft, and you can't get to the draft until you meet that person, and it can be a long and lonely labyrinth. And so what methods are our students using now to find, collect, absorb information as they prepare to write? And how might those methods be impacting their writing? Now, I want to, of course, there are good and bad note-taking technologies, there always have been, and note-taking practices. People can take effective notes or ineffective notes, but today I want to focus on the media through which those notes are being taken. So, of course, there's the good old-fashioned writing by hand, paraphrasing, summarizing, writing comments. I want to say I sent out a message to my pre-writing students. I teach the course in 2 sections now. Initially, it was just for students in humanities and social sciences, but now I teach it also for students in physical and life sciences, all graduate students. And I sent a message and said I was going to be talking here today, and would anybody send me a sample, a screenshot of their notes for me to share? And many of them did, and I'm grateful for that. Some asked to remain anonymous, and some I acknowledge in the final slide. So here is handwriting. Here's an example of just summary. Now this student's notes, this is his summary of an article, and you will notice that he's finessing it, he's formatting his notes, but it's really a summary. There's no comparison, there's no commentary, it's just a tidy summary. There's also of course, the post-it, just putting a note here or there to find something again. There's highlighting, and highlighting has been available for a while, but it's a bit alarming to me, at least, how frequent it's become. And if you want to know about the frequency, I challenge you, go to your university's bookstore and see how many highlighters there are on the wall for sale. At U of T, there's a whole wall, and it's clearly something that's done very often. Now, we might hear some marginal notes as well. These are all kind of traditional, but ineffective in this case, note-taking strategies. Spreadsheets we hope they're using, but many students are not. Many of them haven't really thought about doing that. So those are the traditional technologies, but in 2016, how are our graduate students finding the research that's relevant to their work? How are they doing that in the world of Google? How are they reading? How are they selecting? How are they note-taking, absorbing what they're learning, comparing, and finding a way to synthesize that information that supports the writing of their papers and dissertation? This is a screenshot from the University of Toronto Library. If you go to the U of T library and look for the citation management software page, this is what you'll find. And I wanted to use it here in case some of the technologies are unfamiliar to some of you. You'll see that at the top here, there are video tutorials somewhere there. So if you just go and click on any of these videos. So we see here RefWorks, Zotero, Mendeley, EndNoteWeb, Reference Manager, Wizfolio, Papers. There are any number of them. And many of them were designed as citation management softwares. You put in your citation, and then you can switch it to APA or MLA without the hassle that we had to do when we were graduate students. And I want to just show you a series of quick screenshots from some of these videos to just give a quick run-through of some of the techniques. So this is browsing. You can create a library, and you can use a search term. And I'm going to talk about keywords a little bit, and I want to really clearly differentiate from what we just saw in that great panel on corpus linguistics. In corpus linguistics, keywords are in support of a hypothesis in language studies. But I'm talking about keyword searches for students who don't yet have a hypothesis, and they're not in language studies, and they're putting in keywords like gender identity and seeing if that phrase appears anywhere in any journals. And then they're getting 12,821 hits. And they're downloading 200 of those articles onto their computer or onto the cloud. So here is browsing. You can create a library of journals. You can manage the library on your phone. And fasten your seatbelts. You can read articles on your phone. I've started to ask students now, how many of you read articles on your phone? And the hands go up. Not all of them. People use a variety of techniques, and one of the outcomes of the course is really to say, pay attention to your assumptions. Are your current methods serving you well? Because in my opinion, a good reading strategy is a strategy that serves you as a writer, and a poor reading strategy is a strategy that confuses you as a writer. So if you're choosing to take a course like this course, they've self-selected because they feel they need help. I'm encouraging them to be reflective about how they read and how they note take and whether those strategies are serving them. So some of them are reading on their phone. You can do search terms, and then all of the articles in the database you choose, it will highlight the use of those search terms, and they might be gender identity. This is open access. Then you can go into the articles, and that term will be highlighted everywhere. Now, this is problematic if you're not in corpus linguistics and you're not using words as data. You're using words as a starting point to try to create an understanding. I call this the Starbucks approach to graduate research. You look for a keyword and you find it. You know, where's the nearest Starbucks? There it is. I found it. And one of the things I'd like to try to do is change their understanding of the word find. When you're trying to find something in graduate work, you're not trying to locate it. Only, okay, there's the key word, I'm done. You're trying to discover, you're trying to innovate, you're trying to see what's already been there and in the context of what's there to add something new. So you can see some of the media, the technological media, are just electronic versions of the media I showed before. You can add post-its that are called tags, and then you can keep track of your post-its. This is in Evernote, and this is one of my students' list of all of the tags that she's put, the post-its she's put, according to words. You can use highlighting, and then you can collect all the green highlights and all the yellow highlights. Of course, you can, this is Mendeley now, you can use citation, and you can put the citation into different forms. This particular one is Papers, which is for Macintosh computers. Here, the student is reading in the middle panel and taking notes on the right-hand panel. And the left-hand panel shows some of her categories. In this one, which is Zotero, the student's own files are on the left of the screen here. And then these are the opening lines of several of her notes or articles. This is the opening line of this panel over here, and this is notes from one of the articles she's been reading. And when this student sent me this screenshot, she said, "Oh, Dr. Freeman, I put the quotation marks in with my notes the way you suggested," which alarmed me because I was saying you need to be able to differentiate in your note-taking between direct quotations, paraphrasing, and your own commentary. I wasn't thinking of this as an original idea, but the student has been cutting and pasting notes from the article she's reading over here. And she has not always been clear what is direct quotation, what is paraphrase, and I can feel the shudder go through the room. You can imagine if you do that 50 times, the kind of mess you would be in as you start to try to write. Now, clearly, tools are only as good as the techniques of the people who use them. I don't think ski lifts are a problem, but I think if a young skier, an inexperienced skier, takes a ski lift to a high hill, there could be problems. And similarly, I think if an inexperienced researcher uses these techniques, thinking they're fast, I would argue that there is a false efficiency involved in some of these. They think they can get the stuff fast, they can cut and paste the notes quickly, but it's a false efficiency because they're not really absorbing the material and challenging it. They're not able to refine their key terms and really think about those aren't good keywords that I use first. They're too broad, and I need to narrow down. And so what I would want to encourage is an active exploration of note-taking strategies and reading strategies. Try it. Does it work? Do you remember it? Do you feel you've gained mastery of the content that was in that article? And if not, what strategy might you find that's better? Now, here are a couple of examples from students who are using the technology to better effect. This is Evernote, and the students, these are some of the files that she's got from other articles, and these are her notes, sort of more traditional sorts of notes, but in the right-hand margin. And of course, once she's got them there, she can cite, or she can search by term, she can search by phrase, so you can imagine that for a researcher who's got a better handle on this process, these technologies can be very effective. Same author, different source. Here we've got some bold and more full bibliographical information, but the student's own notes, quotes, and commentary. So back to the 5 stages of composition. As I wind up, I want to suggest a few things to consider. I think it's important to try to help our students realize that the nature of the writing problems they're facing, like choppiness, may be in part in relation to the process they're using, the way they're learning, the way they're gathering their ideas and organizing their ideas. And to help them go back to that concept of invention, which comes from the Latin meaning to find. How do you find? And find doesn't mean locate the way you look for a Starbucks. It means discover. And discovery is a messy, investigative process that doesn't happen quickly. Those notes you take by hand in lectures are very inefficient in one way, but if they help you to know what you know and what to distinguish it from what you don't know, then that's a very important stage. I talk about this in the class in relation to Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive objectives and talk about knowledge. I'm sure this is familiar to everybody here. Knowledge as rote memory, comprehension as knowing something well enough to paraphrase it, being able to apply the same ideas in different contexts, analysis, synthesis, and finally evaluation, these types of thinking that are increasingly difficult. And I help the students to realize that certain kind of note-taking strategies are functioning at lower levels. So highlighting and cutting and pasting, I would say, are even below knowledge. You can highlight Derrida and cut and paste Derrida and know nothing about Derrida. So it feels good because it's green or yellow, and there it is in your notes in green, and you've done something with Derrida, but as long as you don't have to read it, that'll be good. Direct quoting, I often use Derrida because, of course, the writing is complex. It's really difficult to understand. It's much more difficult to paraphrase. So Nancy Summers and Laura Saltz years ago in their Harvard study talked about the fact that novice writers often use direct quotations more than paraphrasing, and there's a reason for that. They don't understand the material well enough to paraphrase it. So note-taking strategies that use direct quotes or highlights are often a sign that people are not yet able to determine what's more or less important. As they start to paraphrase, summarize, as they add their own commentary, as they start to put their notes in spreadsheets and use diagrams to understand how things relate to each other, and finally, as they move up to outlines, I like to help them think of outlines as a strategic plan that involves the activity of evaluation and not just a brainstormed list of what came to their mind first. So in finishing, I want to just thank my students who allowed me to use excerpts of their slides. The U of T Library's citation management, all the slides that were not from students are from the videos on that page if you want to go in and have a closer look. And we're keeping the questions until the end, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jane, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm very happy that you brought up the fact that often the writing issues that we're dealing with in our graduate writing classrooms actually have much more to do with a lack of complete knowledge than a lack of understanding of English and how we use English to express our ideas. So we do need to think about how students are getting ready to write. Are they even getting to write? How are we going to support them as they try to synthesize this overwhelming amount of information that they have surrounding them? So writing issues do really rest a lot of times in a knowledge students have about the content. Another area where students struggle to gain knowledge mastery is in the concept of genre, which of course is an absolutely critical part of the work that we're doing. And I'm going to transition over to Mary Jane here, who will touch on this issue of genre and get us thinking about that a little bit more deeply. Jane?
Thank you very much. Is this the right mic to use? Oh, this one? There's a big choice here.
That's a light.
Oh, that's a light. Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And thank you for inviting me here to speak. I'm honored to be here, especially in this distinguished group of colleagues. I've told my students I feel complete imposter syndrome, so they're not alone. I also find it phenomenal that the ELI here was founded 75 years ago. I was at the Consortium on Graduate Communication conference in June, and so many people there are approaching these topics brand new, from English departments, rhetoric, composition, study support, all kinds of different disciplines and institutional locations. And so a lot of places are just getting around to realizing that they need to be dealing with the issues that a lot of us have been thinking about for a long time, particularly for English learners. So it may be ironic, may not be, that my argument, my strapping argument today is that was a joke, at least in the case of graduate student writing, my argument is that we should move away from any presumed separation of non-native and native-speaking students. To situate myself academically, I've always been interested in academic discourse and access. Access originally meaning access to higher education. My dissertation at another Midwestern institution, not this one, was about immigrant and refugee students in a community college writing class. And then I went on to look at multilingual scholars writing for publication in Europe and more recently in Latin America. So I've always been interested in how people get access to different types of resources, institutions, and academic writing on both ends of that spectrum, and even in the middle, because I've been for the past 13 years in a graduate school of education and research University of Rochester. And I'm the founding director of Writing Support Services there, and I've done some research on graduate student writing there too, which I will talk about. Can move on here. I was just perusing Facebook this morning, and Facebook considerately reposts some of your good posts from the past. So this post came up on I posted this last year, came up perfectly today. So Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin is saying, I used to hate writing assignments, now I enjoy them. I realize that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report? The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study of psychic transrelational gender modes. Academia, here I come. Okay. So it's hard to resist that. I mean, that is brilliant. Okay. So a guru in our field, whose work many of you will know, I'm sure, Christine Cazenave, has been thinking deeply about these issues for a long time. Access, how we demystify academic writing and publishing. And her latest book, I think it's her latest book, she's prolific, there might be another one that I'm not aware of, beautifully sustains her earlier points about academic communication, which is not something that we can expect students to graduate students to come already knowing how to do. And in a very succinct quotation, she says, academic discourse is a second language to everyone, full of terminology, necessary, jargon, needless and pretentious. formal turns of phrases, unfamiliar research methods, theories, and philosophical stances. And to this, I would also add genres. One reason that Christine's point rings so true is that many undergraduates turn out to be fairly ill-prepared in academic writing. Even the domestic students whom we often assume are familiar with the conventions of academic writing, in this large-scale study by Aram and Rochester, I'm not sure if you've seen this, it's alarming. Their findings about students' writing abilities and even the quantity of writing that undergraduates are asked to do are really dismaying. Some of the numbers, ranges of pages that students are asked to write as undergraduates could be 5 to 20 pages per semester. And I've been dismayed at the quality of some of the graduate students who come to our program from the University of Rochester, which has a great undergraduate writing program. So there's a lot that we cannot expect students to do, and not only international students or users of English as an additional language. We also know that many international students have not been asked to do much writing as undergraduates, and many systems around the world are still using examination-based assessments as their dominant forms of assessment. We know that this is one reason for the academic culture shock that many international students experience, which elicits so much dismay from their instructors as well, and unfortunately also can engender inaccurate stereotypes such as Asian students can't think critically, okay? And of course the perennial thing about plagiarism, which I'm not gonna touch with a 10-foot pole. Okay. In my chapter in this supporting graduate communication book, edited by Steve Simpson and others that came out this spring, I argue that those of us in all these different fields that support student writing need to move beyond focusing on mechanics and focus instead on how writing is a way of what Dressen Hamuda calls disciplinary becoming, which I love. I love this phrase because it indexes the important identity work that goes on for graduate students, particularly at the doctoral level. So, touching on what Jane just said, knowing your content, knowing how to talk about your content, knowing how to take a stance or a perspective on your content, and knowing how to make that rhetorically convincing are stages. They're not necessarily linear stages, but they are maybe layers or laminations, as Paul Pryor might call it, that go on that really, if you miss out on those stages, you're not going to get to the end, right? If you don't have content, you can't write your way around anything. In terms of theory that is useful here, we can think about Laban-Wenger's communities of practice theory that offers a lens onto some kind of idealized trajectory. But unfortunately, we know that not all students make it to the end of that trajectory, and in fact, not all academics do either. There's lots of academics who actually don't publish anything. In all of the discussions about academic publishing, what's rarely discussed is how many people are actually not publishing. That's another completely different topic. One of the powerful forces that I think keeps writing teachers and tutors, as well as disciplinary faculty members obsessed with mechanics of language, is the transparency ideology of language, otherwise known as the conduit metaphor, that sees language as the means to convey meaning rather than as being centrally implicated in the construction of meaning. And of course, the corpus linguistics panel, which I found really useful and fascinating, would help us get at the ways that language is implicated in the construction of meaning. The conduit metaphor, I think, also undergirds the skills approach, which is very common in teaching language and writing, and sort of reared its head. I won't characterize its head, but reared its head at the Consortium on Graduate Communication Writing. That it was really apparent to me in that conference how many people, especially people who are outside of the fields of applied linguistics and TESOL, just see writing as mechanics and grammar, however they define grammar. I really believe that we need to shift our perspective from this mechanics-based approach, based on the conduit metaphor, to looking at writing as a social practice, especially, again, when we talk about graduate student writing. A social practice perspective, as you probably know, comes from anthropology, For example, the work of Brian Street has been foundational in helping us shift our thinking from in the field of writing studies to looking at writing as social practices rather than skills. And genre theory is a key way of looking at writing as a social practice. The classic definition of genre from Carolyn Miller as typified rhetorical actions based in recurrent situations helps us think about purpose, audience, and format. And Dressen Hamuda, again, really contributes, I think, a beautifully elaborated definition of genre as socially situated, having typified and recognizable patterns, being relatively stable yet momentarily, being historically and culturally situated, dialogically transmitted, provides for cognitive efficiency, is rhetorical action, but meaningless in isolation from its semiotic chain, and these emphases are her original ones. So I think she's really made a major contribution in this work here. In particular, looking at the way that genre systems are dynamic and constantly evolving. So one of the interests I've developed in thinking about this is just what are all the genres that we're asking students to do? So this is an inventory that a PhD student and I did of what we saw as the genres in our School of Education. From my perspective, running our writing support services, teaching academic writing, working with graduate students, and talking also with students. And so we came up with this list. I'm sure it's not complete, but it's pretty robust. And we analyze these or categorize these into analytic, reflective, and professional and public, with the first two categories as being more functional and the third based more on audience. But I'm sure you could reshuffle those categories in different ways. In a study that I did of engineers writing for publication, I made another list of genres, and it's very interesting, and obviously John knows lots about this when you look at the rhetorical practices in other disciplines in a really fine-grained way. These were genres that came up in a study focusing on graduate students, postdocs, and faculty writing for publication, so these are not meant to represent undergraduate genres, although some of them probably do. So this is a smaller range of genres than in the previous example, but what's important here is how they represent the different social practices in the two graduate school environments. And one of the reasons I chose engineering as the focus of that study is that engineering is a discipline that spans academia and industry. So you can see, for example, patents. Many of us might have copyrights, but I don't know how many of us have patents. Maybe in the corpus world that's more of a possibility. But patents are actually a kind of currency of engineering, academia, and industry, the way that articles or books might be for us. What's also interesting in terms of social practices is that first or second year doctoral students in engineering, and even master's students, and even I discovered in my study in a not yet finished paper, there's undergraduate students writing for publication. So we always, I don't know who we is, I would criticize my students for saying that, but we often think about a trajectory, which gets back to part of my title, of going from student papers, comprehensive exams, dissertation proposals, dissertations, and then at the end of the tunnel, you're thinking about writing a paper. Well, that's very much a humanities, social sciences-based kind of view of the publishing or the writing into publishing perspective for students. In engineering and in other sciences, you're in the lab right away, you're involved, and you may even have your name on a paper in your first year. Now, what writing means in that context is a whole other conversation. So it just, I think, helps us step back a little bit from our own assumptions, and this is always, I think, important for us, those of us who are researching our own practices, which is what we're doing when we're researching academic writing. When we're researching academic publishing, it's very easy to think you already know what you're finding because you've done it yourself. So it doesn't mean what you think is necessarily wrong, but that's different than actually researching it. So doing this engineering study was really illuminating for me. I'm not going to go back to the slide listing the genres, but an academic article in engineering is 8 to 10 pages long. And you write it as your conference proposal, and boom, you're done. So they don't have this backlog that I have of, X number of papers, I won't even put a number on, that haven't been finished after a conference. Again, whose authors, where the authorship goes, the last author is the most important. All kinds of different social practices are happening in different disciplines. Okay. One of the things, this is just jumping around a tiny bit here, one of the things I wanted to bring in here was some of the findings that we have in the longitudinal study that Teresa Lillis and I have been doing since 2001. We keep thinking it's over, but it never seems to end. And we studied these scholars in Europe, and later I've done a subsequent small study in Latin America, in Chile. We were really interested in the social practices of writing for publication, and we found some very important roles of other people in the context of writing for publication. People we call literacy brokers, the ways that those brokers are implicated in academic research networks, and the ways that they may or may not help novice or junior or student scholars come into those networks, and the different strategies and tactics that they're using for writing for publication. Very little of this has to do with academic language proficiency, with prepositions, with mechanics. There are ways that that matters, that those things matter. But what we found was that some of our people in the study, some of the 50 scholars in the study who would have maybe the lowest levels of English proficiency on any measure you can think of, were publishing more than anybody else. And in the reverse, in all these conversations about multilingual scholars writing for publication, people often forget, and international students often need to be explained, that just because you're a native speaker doesn't mean you can write for publication. And anybody who's read anybody else's paper knows that. So when we think about, try to tie all of this together, how does this affect the ways in which we view teaching academic writing to graduate students, helping graduate students along this kind of trajectory of whatever the trajectory may be, it may not be linear, to writing the kinds of genres that they want to write at different moments in their academic careers or subsequent careers. To me, all of these argue for looking at the kinds of texts, the genres that they're writing, as embedded in the social context, as representing these social practices and power relations and conventions and dynamics that they need to understand, more than just thinking about who's your audience, who's your imagined audience, is it your grandmother or your professor, who is it really? And what they ultimately have to come to is what we know when we're writing for publication. When I write an article for publication, I'm pretty sure Brian's going to read it. I don't necessarily write the article for Brian, but I know that there's probably 50 to 100 to 200 people who are interested in academic publishing as a research topic. And that's the expert community that I'm writing for. Students really don't even have a sense of the names on their Tardy 2009. They don't have a picture of Christine Tardy. In my doctoral writing class last year, I piloted an assignment where they do a scholar-author study, and I have them actually research a scholar's career who is in there. It's basically literature review writing course for doctoral students, and I have them figure out who they think their core author is for their research topic, and then research that person and go to their webpage and get a picture and my next step would be to get them on Skype. Actually, one of my students actually had a phone call with her person, and she was amazed that this person answered the phone and, was thrilled to talk to her. I said to her, listen, if anybody calls me up and wants me to talk about me, I'll do it, not a problem. I'll find the time. So, but it was such a valuable activity for them to start to see scholars as people, and scholars as people, so that when we use the metaphor of entering the scholarly conversation, this is not just a metaphor. This is a real thing. So we'll see what that does for them down the line. So thank you very much.
okay. It was embedded. No, it was embedded. That's okay. Another set of very stimulating thoughts for us to take away. I think so far we're getting a theme here that much of the conversation here is based on strategy, right? Strategy on the ins and outs of publishing, strategy in getting ready to write and using the appropriate tools in the appropriate manner, strategy as it pertains to genre knowledge, and the fact that the genre knowledge you need may not follow a predictable timetable. Again, coming back to what Jane has also said earlier. Our next speaker, you know, it seems like every time you introduce people, you're supposed to say, this speaker doesn't really need an introduction. And I think that's part of the genre, although I don't do this very often, so I don't know. But I think in this case, it's actually true. The next speaker that we have coming up is John Swales. And I think many of us owe much of what we've done professionally to the work of John Swales. Particularly his work with genre analysis and other scholarly works that he has undertaken. But John is one of those rare individuals who's not just a scholar, who's like a walking encyclopedia and can see connections where no one else can see them. But John is also a classroom teacher who's had a huge impact on his graduate students, on the students that he has had in his graduate writing courses from across the disciplines. And John is also a teacher to all of us. So I'm going to turn the floor over to John, who's going to try to tie things up for us a bit. I actually don't have any idea what he's really talking about. It was supposed to be 12 things about academic writing for graduate students, not the book, but the concept of writing at the graduate level. So without further ado, I'll have John come up and tie things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I don't think I'm going to tidy anything up. I think I'm probably going to step backwards because my title is 13 aha moments in graduate communications education. Or if you want to talk posh, 13 epiphanies in graduate communications education. And so this is a look back. So we start in 1978, when I first became involved in graduate communications. Previously, I'd been in Africa, and I just taught undergraduates. I was now in charge of a small ELI-type unit at a British university, and we were beginning to get more and more graduate students basically from the Middle East, places like Venezuela, and so on. I had a house in the north of England where my family remained while I looked for a house in Birmingham. And so I lived temporarily with a big friend of mine called, a strapping friend of mine called Tony Dudley Evans. Yeah. And so I went off to Aston in Birmingham University to teach academic writing for international graduate students. And Tony went to Birmingham. And I stayed with him for 3 or 4 months, and we devolved a system whereby we would write some materials together. The one I remember best was how you deal with discrepancies in the data. And he went to Birmingham and taught it. I went to Aston. We came back. We pooled our experiences and revised it. And that was an obvious way of, I think, developing materials. And this is one which Chris and I have followed pretty well the rest of our time here. Moving on, 1980, the University of Aston, in the library, Friday afternoon, I suspect, reading a review of a book by the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz about Bali. The review talks about the ritualized genres of courtly life. Genre, that is the term I've been looking for. That is the concept that has been eluding me, but it's been on the periphery of my vision for the last 2 or 3 years. Now I can make some progress with that concept. 1981, opening my copy of English for Specific Purposes and reading the article by Elaine Tyrone and some of her students. She says, they say, in methods, the passive is used for standard procedure, I or we and the active is used for innovations. So a standard three-dimensional box was constructed, then we added a fourth dimension. Up until then, I have been telling my students, if they're writing a report or whatever, you either use the passive or you personalize it and you use I or we. Now, Elaine Tyrone tells me that there is a very strong form-function correlation here with the active for innovation, the passive for procedural standard. And so I thought that was just great. However, my attempts to validate it or verify it have so far not proved very successful, but it's a great thought. 1983, I got involved with teaching writing workshops for a new scheme that's been developed at Aston University called Late Entrance to Higher Degrees. And these are mostly mid-level business executives and engineers who want to move into research and development or something. And they're all native speakers, or almost all. My first contact with native speakers at this level, outside of linguistics, and their struggles to move from the clear, succinct memos and reports of their past lives to the qualifications and problematics of the research world gave me quite a lot to think about. And so I began in 1983 to first begin to realize that native speakers of English also probably could do with some help. 1985, number 5. University of Michigan, I've arrived here. A talk in the English department by composition expert Lillian Bridwell Bowles. She talks of discourse communities, first time I'd heard that term, as being very different from the speech communities beloved by sociolinguists. Yes, this adds a new dimension to my thinking about the academic world. 1986, Virginia Samuda, a noted methodologist and a lecturer at the ELI at that time, is looking at some of my teaching materials. And she says, well, John, they could be more tasky. Wonderful adjective. Exactly. From that time onwards, continuing thoughts about what I like to call taskology. 1977 to 1988, I started teaching classes for people writing their dissertations. I have a student from Iran, who I'll call Ali. He comes from electronics. He has been asked to draft one of those long conference abstracts for his professor. We worked on it over several sessions. We eventually thought we got it good enough for him to take it to the famous professor, one who also won a lot of prizes for technical writing. The professor basically accepted it, but totally rewrote the introduction because he was able to link it to certain national developments and major funding sources, which neither Ali nor I could do. I learned there's only so much you can do as a lab rat and a language rat. 1992, for the first time I give a workshop for the graduate school in the assembly hall out there. It's a cold November evening. Where are all those people going? They're coming to my workshop on writing a literature review. 200 people across the assembly room, panic around the whole building's photocopiers to do copies of my handouts, and mostly native speakers. Obviously, unmet demand. 1994, back in Birmingham for a visit. I go to see the late Tim Johns, who shows me his electronic kibitzer on when in scientific writing data is singular and when it is plural. Data is or data are. I begin to see the merit of specialized corpora. 2000, number 10. Chris Feak explains how she makes her advanced doctoral students bring a couple of journal articles from their special field to her one-on-one tutorials, so she can better appreciate the disciplinary conventions of particular fields and subfields. Why haven't I been doing that? 2004, reading Paul Charney and Kendall's article on the reception of the first articles about chaos theory, begin to think we have paid too much attention to the processes of writing, not enough to the reception of those writing afterwards. We're helping everybody to get to publication, but there's a question that arises, is anybody going to read it? Or is anybody going to cite it? So that was the issue that I've become involved with. And perhaps only by paying attention to the reception can we ever really show that writing matters. We're able to show that this one has a big pickup and this one doesn't. A reason why, possibly it's writing. So on to reception studies, one showing that the two most successful articles published in the 1990s in the main journal of my field, the one that Chris co-edits now, were A, written by women, 2, by non-native speakers of English, and 3, by people who are working in out-of-the-way places, universities you've hardly heard of. Number 12, getting towards the end, Angela will be pleased, attending a seminar on the history of art. I noticed that descriptions of pictures never simply go general to specific, context to art object, or specific to general, art object back to the context or the background, unlike all other texts that I've been looking at, that jump about. Never seen that before. Obvious though, really, because you put in the minds of the viewer something like this. Why are you telling me so much about the picture when at this juncture I really need to know about the context so I can orient myself to the picture? On the other hand, why are you telling me so much about the context? Well, I'm getting impatient, waiting for you to tell me something so I can better understand and appreciate the picture. Number 13. I recently had a project I was asked to assess the quality of writing in NIH research grant proposals from the medical faculty here. And so we agreed that a group of us, including Chris and Mindy up there, would all have a meeting. And some people came from information scientists came from a place called the Map of Science. A woman was brought in from Cambridge University, and we had a 2-hour meeting where we looked and commented on some of the writing in these NIH research proposals. What struck me, and it never struck me like this before, was how much attention was being paid to the visual appearance of the grant proposal. In a published article, the format is decided by the publisher. If you've got a 12-page grant proposal packed with information, then questions arise of paragraphing, bolding, italics, underlining. What do you do? And that's what people were focusing on. And so I know we do this with resumes, but maybe we should also be thinking about in grant proposals. And so that's my 13 in nearly 40 years. There may be yet a 14th aha moment, maybe indeed something that somebody will say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I think what what John has said does help tie everything together, and that is, as instructors of graduate level writing, we have to constantly be learning and keeping up with the changes and never assume that we finally have figured it out. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we were promised time for questions and answers, and I really hope that we still have that. So at this point, I would like to open up the floor to anybody who has a question for any one of our panelists, or if there is something that you are wondering about that has not come up during the course of the panel. Also, I think we're open to talking about just about anything in terms of graduate writing.
This is a question for Jane. I very much enjoyed the paper, but I'm also a little bit worried about the potential reductionism of a technique as opposed to what it is that people do. And I'm saying this because I'm a champion highlighter, and I think that every time I switch from yellow to blue, I've made a decision, I've understood something, I've analyzed it, and it looked as though on the paper you showed, and certainly on mine, there are, endless shifts in the way it does that cue me into how I read this for the first time. And this is something I always do if I'm going to teach an article, because I can go back again 5 years later and see how I read it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Is this mic on? No, I think you need to flip it on the top. There you go. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I tried to say, I was aware the time was short and was trying to move quickly. I was trying to say the tools are as good as the handler of the tools. And maybe I didn't get that point across clearly enough with the analogy of the ski lift, that good researchers can use any of these tools to good effect. But when students use highlighting when they're reading and they think this paragraph is interesting, this paragraph is interesting, this paragraph is interesting, and then they come back and they've got all these paragraphs that are interesting, they're getting overloaded. But I did not mean to imply that any of these media were not effective in their ways, but that the media need to be used in ways that help the writer. So in the course, I encourage students to differ from one another in the media they use, but to look at the function that media is performing for them. So is it helping you to compare things? Is it helping you to define things? Is it helping you to locate things? And if you're using the same approach to do everything and it's confusing you, then it might be better to vary that approach. I do think that for people who've done a lot of researching already, our note-taking is more robust. And whether we think about our tools consciously or not, we use tools that work for us. But the students I'm encountering are expressing an experience of intense overload and conceptual confusion. They don't yet have guiding research questions that help them to even pick what to highlight, so they can be indiscriminate in that. So I hope I made that point clear, that it's not the tools that are the problem, but any more than ski lifts should be banned, but just understanding the impacts they have. Thank you.
Is it working? Okay, cool. So it's a comment rather than a question on something that came up in several of the remarks, I think especially in Mary Jane Curry's comments, namely the suggestion to move away from the native versus non-native writer, which I would agree a native writer doesn't exist. And I just wanted to say that there's lots of corpus evidence to support that, including a study I did on phraseological patterns in MyCusp, comparing the native section and the non-native section of MyCusp. We didn't initially have that as a feature in the online search interface until someone suggested that, or requested it really, because I didn't think there would be lots of differences, and what I found supported that in terms of phrases and chunks, both the native and the non-native speaker writers, I guess, know how to use academic phrases, and there are no significant differences between them. And also, based on my own experience, I'm a native speaker of German, but please don't ask me to write anything academic in German. I usually just, I wouldn't know how to do that. So there's a lot of corpus evidence to support that comment and that suggestion.
Well, I'd like to get that reference from you. I mean, obviously there's differences in how people use language as a resource based on native, non-native status of any language, but I think from a teaching perspective and the way that students are traditionally segregated, and of course when we talk about native English speakers, I mean there's a huge range of populations in our so-called native speakers, and that was among my original research interests in terms of immigrant students. We have generation 1.5. We've got all kinds of ways of labeling and categorizing students. But I think my push there is really to suggest that while the mechanics of writing are important, and while you can't separate out language from writing, obviously, when we only focus on what I really would call mechanics or surface level features and kind of fetishize spelling, punctuation, grammar, etc., we're really wasting valuable time in terms of helping students understand genres, discourse communities, how knowledge is constructed, and who's doing it. So I think that's the elaboration. Looks like we've answered all the questions. We've covered all of academic writing. And they want.
I would like to just, I don't know if this is on, maybe not. Okay, no.
Once you hit the switch, it takes 4 or 5 seconds before it
Oh,
starts.
there we go. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I can't agree more with what Mary Jane has just said. And I think, too, one of the challenges that graduate students are facing, in addition to the note-taking part, is just reading in general. And I think, too, one of the challenges that we have to also consider is that we speak to write, we read to write, we write and we talk, and then we write and then we read some more. And so I think, too, another thing that we need to be kind of thinking more broadly about is how do we include all aspects of communication into a writing course, that it's not just enough to say, well, here's the genre, right? And I think one of the after effects of having a really good graduate level writing course is that the students report being better readers. They're finally beginning to notice things like may as perhaps a very important word in the writing of an academic text, when they're used to using their reading time to get content and not read to understand how authors compose their texts and make arguments.
I think I can talk loud enough. I don't need a microphone. I teach in a Spanish-speaking country, and I have many friends who are teachers, and often they will come to me and ask me to read the essays and to grade the essays. Well, my specialties are listening and speaking and this kind of thing, and so I do it because I think I ought to try to help them. But my problem is, and I'll tell you how I've resolved some of it, is do you go for meaning? Can you understand what it is they're trying to get it across? Or what do you do about mechanics? So I have this dichotomy between what I should write on the paper, for one thing, that both the teacher and the student will see, and how much of that, for me, one way I want to focus on the meaning. Can I understand what this student was trying to put across? On the other hand, perhaps that's unfair because I'm letting some of the mechanics go, and likely in another situation it may be a teacher who thinks it's the mechanics that are important and never mind everything else, but this person can't control mechanics. So I try to help them out, and I don't know that you can give me any answers today, but it's a dilemma when you're the only English language native English first language speaker in the vicinity, and you're asked to do some of these things. I can't refuse, but on the other hand, it's a very tight rope for me to walk as to how I should work on it. So maybe someone can write an article someday to help me out.
Yeah, well, there's a lot out there. I mean, I think that's actually a great illustration of the point about social practices. So my first question to you would be, what are these texts being used for, right? So are they in English classes? Are they in content classes? Are they, you know, what's the purpose of that text? Because unless you know that, you really don't even know what to look for. And in terms
Often
of
these are tests, though.
These are tests.
These are
yeah,
tests,
okay.
short essays.
So I mean,
with a given topic, yeah.
well then, ideally, they would have a grading rubric, so you could have both content and language assessed simultaneously. I mean, there are ways of assessing writing where you can balance out. So you're not too much on the extreme of I'm just going to correct every wrong usage, incorrect, non-native, whatever you want to call it. So I think, I mean, it's actually a fantastic example because it really gets at the heart of the conundrum. And I know that when I'm a Spanish speaker, and you know, when you read a text where you know the native language of the student, then you can identify better what they're trying to say, and so the meaning is probably more transparent to you anyhow because you speak Spanish, and you're in that context. So that gets to the purpose of the question of audience. You know, who is reading the text? I mean, a text written as a test is not a very authentic text to begin with. So that raises all kinds of other questions. But I think coming up with some kind of rubric or set of standards that you are using to evaluate the text can help you balance out content and mechanics so you can actually do both at the same time without going crazy.
Thank you. Often I'm asked to put a grade on it from 1 to 100. And, well, I appreciate any references, any help you can give me, because I can't refuse the people, and yet how can I be helpful?
The person you want to talk to is sitting right here in the pink, Deborah Cruza. She's the writing assessment expert.
We can talk later.
I mean, really, she's it.
So, yes, I mean, there's so much to talk about, there's so much I could say, but I am the child of restaurateurs, and so I feel deep shame in my own role in delaying your lunch, coming between you and food. And I just want to correct John that I would ever be happy that he's coming to the end. I only am sorry that we have delayed things and pinched a little on the time of this fantastic panel. So thank you for a wonderful presentation. So we do have lunch for you, and I just have every confidence in the world that there is coffee, too, and all the other beverages that go with lunch across the hall in the assembly hall. Also, we have a lot going on for you. We have boxed lunches for you. Even if you didn't RSVP, the numbers here, we have lunch for everyone, so please help yourself to lunch and to drinks. Our ELI faculty and their collaborators across campus will be presenting interesting current initiatives that are happening at the ELI via posters. We're experimenting with a new genre, which is a sort of a lunchtime poster conversation, quite informal. Please grab a lunch, pick a table, feel free to roam a bit. If you're interested in seeing the rest of the television episode, The Search, that will be showing in the West Conference Room. We're going to start that in about 10 or 15 minutes. We also have some video testimonials from current and recent ELI students. These are the poster presentations from our ELI colleagues. I'm not going to read through them, but there you can get a sense of what's over in the other room. There's really fantastic stuff there. Thank you for your patience. We're obviously, and we will come back here at 1:45. We'll try to start back at 1:45. Thank you. We heard you over.